It's minus 40 degrees in Siberia, your phone's dead, and the only thing standing between you and hypothermia is a car that looks like it rolled off the assembly line in 1975. Now, most modern vehicles would give up and die, but not this one. This boxy, stubborn piece of Soviet engineering fires up like it's just another Tuesday. I'm talking about the Lada, and before you click away thinking this is just another car history lesson, let me tell you something that'll blow your mind. This car that the rest of the world laughed at for decades is still being made today, and Russians would rather fix it with duct tape and prayer than buy anything else. If you're ready to discover why an entire nation refuses to let go of what might be the world's most underestimated automobile, smash that like button right now and subscribe, because this story goes way deeper than you think. The Lada isn't just a car, it's a symbol of survival, national pride, and one of the most fascinating economic experiments in automotive history. Let me take you back to 1966, right in the heart of the Cold War. The Soviet Union is watching the West cruise around in their Fords and Chevrolets, and the Kremlin has a problem. Their people are stuck driving the Moskvich in the Volga, cars so outdated they made a Model T look futuristic. The Soviet leadership knew they needed something better, something that could be mass-produced and actually work in the brutal Russian climate, where winter doesn't ask for permission and roads are more like suggestions. So they did something unexpected. They made a deal with Fiat, the Italian automaker. Yeah, you heard that right. The communists partnered with the capitalists. They licensed the Fiat 124, a car that had just won European Car of the Year, and decided to build it in a brand new factory in Tolyatti, a city on the Volga River. But here's where it gets interesting, and trust me, this is where the Russian genius kicks in. They didn't just copy the Fiat, they rebuilt it from the ground up to survive Russia. The engineers added thicker steel, raised the suspension for terrible roads, modified the engine to handle low-quality fuel, and reinforced everything because Russian winters don't care about your Italian design sensibilities. When the first Lada rolled off the line in 1970, it was technically a Fiat, but practically a tank. They called it the VAZ 2101, but everyone knew it as the Zhiguli, though that name got changed to Lada for export because Zhiguli sounded a bit too much like gigolo in some languages, and you can imagine how that marketing meeting went. Now here's something wild. In the 1970s, the Lada wasn't just a Soviet success, it was an international phenomenon. The cars were cheap, really cheap, sometimes half the price of comparable Western vehicles. They flooded into Europe, Canada, and even made it to the United States for a brief moment. British buyers loved them because they were affordable and surprisingly reliable for the price. Sure, the handling was like steering a shopping cart full of bricks, and the interior looked like it was designed by someone who'd never actually sat in a car, but it ran and it kept running. Finance people in the Soviet system were celebrating because the Lada became one of the USSR's most successful export products, bringing in desperately needed hard currency. By the early 1980s, the Lada factory in Tolyatti was producing over 700,000 cars a year, making it one of the largest automobile plants in the world. But then, and this is where the story takes a dark turn, the Soviet Union started crumbling. The 1980s brought economic stagnation, and by 1991, the entire communist system collapsed. Imagine being the Lada factory manager, waking up one morning to find out your country doesn't exist anymore. The financial support vanished overnight, the supply chains that stretched across the Soviet republics broke apart, and suddenly you're trying to compete with Toyota, Volkswagen, and Ford in a free market. Most people thought Lada would die right there. Western cars flooded into Russia, offering features the Lada could never match. Airbags, fuel efficiency, comfort, design that didn't look like a geometry lesson gone wrong. The 1990s were brutal for Lada. Sales plummeted, the factory struggled, and financial analysts wrote obituaries for the brand. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming, and pay close attention because this is the heart of why Russia still obsesses over this car. The Lada refused to die, and more importantly, the Russian people refused to let it die. Want to know why? It comes down to three things that matter more than luxury or status: affordability, repairability, and national pride.
Let's talk money first, because in the harsh world of Russian economics, the Lada became a lifeline. After the Soviet collapse, the Russian economy was in free fall. The ruble was worthless, unemployment skyrocketed, and the average person couldn't dream of affording a Western import. But Lada kept the prices low, absurdly low. Even through the 1998 financial crisis that devastated Russia, you could still buy a Lada for a fraction of what a used foreign car would cost. For millions of Russians living outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, in the small towns and villages where average monthly income was a few $100s, the Lada wasn't just affordable, it was the only option. But here's where it gets beautiful in a weird, mechanical way. The Lada became the most repairable car on planet Earth. Western cars had computer systems, specialized parts, and required trained technicians with expensive diagnostic equipment. The Lada, you could fix it with a hammer, some wire, and a bottle of vodka for courage. I'm not joking. The design was so simple, so deliberately over-engineered for harsh conditions that rural Russians became shade tree mechanics out of necessity. Parts were everywhere because millions of these cars saturated the country. Your neighbor had one, your uncle had one, the abandoned car in the field had parts you could use. This created an entire shadow economy around Lada maintenance. And let's be honest for a second, there's something deeply satisfying being able to fix your own car in your driveway instead of being held hostage by a dealership charging you $200 to plug in a computer. The Lada gave Russians independence and control in a world where they had very little of either. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, national pride. And this is where it gets emotional. After the Soviet Union fell, Russians watched their superpower status evaporate. The military declined, the economy tanked, and Western culture flooded in like they'd won some kind of cultural war. For many Russians, especially older generations, the Lada represented something that was still theirs, still Russian, still refusing to bow to Western superiority. It wasn't the best car, and everyone knew it, but it was their car. There's a defiance in driving a Lada, a middle finger to the idea that Russian engineering is inferior. Sure, the Mercedes is nicer, but the Mercedes never had to start in Norilsk, where it's dark for 2 months straight and cold enough to freeze diesel fuel. The Lada did, and it did it every single day.
This psychological connection runs deep, deeper than car enthusiasts in America might understand. It's similar to how Americans feel about certain domestic brands, that emotional loyalty that transcends logic and specifications. Fast forward to the 2000s and 2010s, and you'd think with Russia's economy recovering under Putin, with oil money flowing and a growing middle class, the Lada would finally fade away. But something fascinating happened instead. The brand evolved while keeping its core identity. AUTOSAYS, the company that makes Lada, partnered with Renault-Nissan, bringing in modern technology and manufacturing techniques. They started producing new models like the Lada Vesta and the X-Ray that actually looked contemporary and had features like airbags, ABS, and infotainment systems. But here's the genius move. They kept the prices low and maintained that reputation for simplicity and repairability. They understood that their customer base wasn't just buying transportation, they were buying into an identity. Even young Russians who grew up after the Soviet collapse and had access to global car markets started embracing Ladas with an ironic but genuine affection. Social media exploded with Lada memes, modification communities, and even a strange respect from international car enthusiasts who appreciated the utilitarian brutality of Soviet engineering. The Lada became cool in the way that anything sufficiently retro and resilient becomes cool. It survived when it shouldn't have, it works when it shouldn't, and it doesn't apologize for what it is. Today, in 2025, the Lada is still the best-selling car brand in Russia, outselling Toyota, Volkswagen, and Hyundai in its home market. Let that sink in for a moment. In an era of electric vehicles, autonomous driving, and cars that can parallel park themselves, the descendant of a 1960s Fiat, built in a factory that was supposed to showcase Soviet industrial might, is still winning in the largest country on Earth. Western sanctions after 2022 actually helped Lada because foreign automakers pulled out of Russia, leaving a vacuum that domestic manufacturers filled. What was once a weakness, that isolation from global supply chains, became a strength because Lada had spent decades learning to survive with limited resources.
The financial numbers tell an incredible story. AUTOSAYS, despite every economic crisis, every political upheaval, and every prediction of its demise, is still operating, still employing tens of thousands of people in Togliatti, still pumping out hundreds of thousands of vehicles every year. It's not just surviving in its own market, on its own terms, it's thriving. So what's the lesson here? And why should Americans watching this on their big screens care about a Soviet-era car most of them have never seen in person? Because the Lada story is about way more than automobiles. It's about resilience, about how products become embedded in national identity, about how sometimes the inferior option wins, not because it's better, but because it understands its market better than anyone else. It's about how economic constraints can create innovative solutions, how simplicity can be a feature rather than a bug, and how brand loyalty isn't always about quality. Sometimes it's about shared struggle and survival. The Lada succeeded because it was exactly what Russia needed when Russia needed it most, and it continues to succeed because it never pretended to be something it wasn't. In a world obsessed with luxury features and status symbols, the Lada said, "I'll get you there, I won't break your bank, and you can fix me when I do break." And honestly, that's a compelling value proposition that transcends borders. So the next time you see a beat-up car that looks like it should have been in a junkyard a decade ago still chugging along, remember the Lada. Remember that survival isn't about being the best, it's about being exactly good enough and refusing to quit. If this story changed how you think about cars, economics, or national pride, hit that like button, subscribe to AUTOSAYS for more deep dives into automotive history that actually matters, and drop a comment telling me what underdog car from your country deserves this kind of respect. Thanks for watching, and remember, the best car isn't always the fastest or the fanciest, sometimes it's just the one that refuses to die.